Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready for the discussion from Voices of a New Generation. Please welcome the moderator for this panel, author and global TV show host, back at the Urban League one more time, Shannon Lanier.
All right, good morning, everyone. How are we doing? Are we awake? Oh, yeah. Come on. Are we awake out there? How are y'all doing this morning? All right, we're alive. We're feeling good. You have your health. And I hope you're taking notes because there are a lot of jewels being dropped and that will continue to be dropped during this conference, like the Honorable Arnie Duncan giving those call to actions. I hope you're taking heed and paying attention. We want you to follow us on social media, get involved in the conversation, and continue it there after this conference is over. All right, so again, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we'd like to get right down to business by first welcoming our panel who will be weighing in on today's topic of who will comprise the next generation of leadership in the urban community. First up on our panel, we have Janae Ingram, the National Executive Director for the National Action Network. Brandy Richard, President of the National Urban League Young Professionals, and she's also the National Urban League Trustee. Kevin E. Hooks, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Las Vegas Urban League. Reverend Tony Lee, Convener for the BYV Black Men and Boys Initiative National Coalition of Black Civic Participation. Dr. Andra Gillespie, Associate Professor of Political Science at Emory University. Maya Wiley, Counsel to the Mayor of New York City. She's also the founder and former president of the Center for Social Inclusion. And before we go any further, I would like to take just a quick moment, I know they have the music playing, but a quick moment of silence for all those innocent men and women of color who have lost their lives unnecessarily to the injustices we are facing in our communities. Sandra Bland, Samuel Du Bois, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, and the Emmanuel 9 in South Carolina. And the list goes on and on and on and continues to grow. And I know there are many issues facing our urban communities right now, and it's hard to ignore one of the most glaring concerns that's out there. So let's start with one of the things that's been pinned, the hashtag Black Lives Matter. Now, I'm supposed to have a mic up here, but I'm going to walk right over there. I'm going to ask the first question, and as you're answering, I'll just walk over there. You know, it seems like, and we'll start with Janae since you're right here, that we're still fighting some of the injustices that we fought during the civil rights movement. But do you think that during that time it was easier to sort of galvanize around one person or leader because it seemed like there were less people leading that fight opposed to now where there are many trying to fight that fight? And how do you think that new dynamic of so many people trying to get their hands on and help is affecting or hurting or helping our cause?
I think that's a great question as you join us. Good morning, National Urban League. I'm so excited to be here this morning. I think that's a great question in terms of leadership, but I would actually challenge that there were as many people leading then as there are now. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, coming out, you know, now we're in this moment where we look back and we reflect and we think of probably 3 leaders. But there were just as many leaders then as there are now. There, you know, you had so many people who were leading different efforts and leading different movements. You had different movements. And then you had people who weren't necessarily leading an organization, but who were doing the work on the ground. And so I think it's the same thing now. I don't really see a difference in that. I think now we're able to see it and live it in real time. So we see, you know, so many leaders, and we see so many movements, and we see organizations, and we see people who aren't affiliated with organizations who are just literally doing the work on the ground, and it's the same thing.
Now, you bring up a good point in saying we're seeing it now, and I think that's the difference between some of the things that people say, oh, all this is happening, but do you guys think this has been happening all along? We're just now able to capture it because of social media, because of cameras?
Yes. Sorry.
I'll jump in and say
Yes.
Anyone else?
I've always said the civil rights movement never ended. I think we look at it as, oh, well, now we can have the same public accommodations as everyone else. But that was the tip of the iceberg. And I think when we stopped looking at all of the issues that needed to be addressed in gaining equal rights and equity, we sort of lost our focus and lost sight of what was really important and what we were trying to do. And when I say we, I know that there are a lot of people who stayed focused on that. National Urban League is one of those organizations that has been there throughout and will continue to be there. And Nan, we're the baby of the civil rights family. We're only 25, well, we'll be 25 next year. And so we came in at a time when probably a lot of people weren't focusing on the issues of police brutality, and that's a big part of what we started focusing on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to both echo that and say that, the civil rights movement didn't start in the 50s. It actually started with the abolition of slavery. So even the way we talk about the civil rights movement is too limited. So the point about is we have actually been in a struggle for citizenship in this country since the 1600s. And each phase of that changes not based just on leadership, because I think the point is we have many, many, many different kinds of leaders, and we always have. The question is whether or not that it becomes explosive in the form of a movement, right, which is a different kind of activity that happens. And I think what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter is really an expression of a level of frustration that has grown over decades because of the actual exclusion of black communities from all forms of opportunity, and most symbolized in the form of the deaths of innocent black people.
Mm-hmm. So what type of leader should we be looking to right now? I know you study a lot of this in your work. What type of leader should we be looking for? What characteristics should they possess in order to help continue this fight?
Well, I think getting to some of the earlier questions, I think we have a very romanticized Hollywood type of version of what the civil rights movement was, and a lot of that has to do with how stuff is oversimplified in K through 12 education and other types of things. So you think, oh, it was all Martin Luther King and there was this cult of personality, and the truth was that it was very varied and there were many leaders. And so I think the same thing applies today, is that we shouldn't be looking for one singular leader or a cult of personality, that it's going to take many different types of leaders, because there are as many different experiences of blackness as there are black people in the United States, and so a lot of those different perspectives have to be brought to the table, and you can't expect one organization to be the be-all and end-all of that. So one of the things that people have critiqued the civil rights movement, the second wave of the civil rights movement as we know it from the 50s and 60s, was that it was actually a very middle-class based movement. And so one of the things about Black Lives Matter is that social media has helped to kind of democratize the movement a little bit more. So you have younger people who were involved the same way that people were involved in SNCC in the 1960s, but you also have a little bit more class diversity because people have greater access to social media in ways that may not have previously existed. I think there's still probably a tendency toward more middle class types of policy initiatives, but now there are ways to circumvent that haven't existed before. But the thing that's actually really interesting about that is, when I teach my unit on civil rights in my African American politics class, we go through why the 1950s, like why does it explode at that point? And so there is the people are mad theory, but a much more compelling theory for me is this idea that you have the right social, political, and economic conditions kind of coming together at the same time. And so part of that is social media as a new form of communication, which would have been the equivalent of the phone tree in the 1950s. You have a political moment where people feel empowered because there's an African American president. And while we have had a lot of economic dislocation, there have also been places of opportunity where people can actually see that maybe we can actually affect change. So if people are really, really discouraged and downtrodden, they will usually keep quiet. But when they feel that there's an opening, that there's a path for breakthrough, they will actually make a wider hole and actually try to push through and make something happen. And so I think we should be encouraged by that.
Now, Kevin, it does seem like that social media is the new March on Washington. What other ways would you see, I know with your work with the National Urban League, would you help encourage other people to also get involved besides social media?
Yeah, I think the information, especially recognizing the truths of the civil rights movement, is something that we can borrow from today. You have to realize that during the height of the civil rights movement, over a 4.5-year period, there was 329 uprisings in 257 cities. All of that was led by the majority of that was led by young people who wanted to make a difference in their local community, and so, in your local markets, recognizing that the change that we are experiencing and the change that we seek will only happen if leaders in local area decide to take up the cause and recognize that, in all of the civil rights era, there was never a messianic leader, even though Dr. King is sort of held as that individual that we think of. The truth of the matter is that there were young people, just like everyone in this audience, who were taking up the mantle of leadership in their local communities and affecting change.
And historically, we'll look back and know who those people are. Right now, as we're in it, we're not paying attention to some of those names necessarily, and some of those people prefer to be nameless because they're not concerned about getting the credit. They're concerned about actually seeing something happen. One of the things that I want to point out is the fact that beyond Reconstruction, we had lynchings in this country that impacted our folks. Every 4 days, a black person would die as a result of a lynching. And so now what we're seeing on television, via media, news, what have you, are stories that have been buried, where people have been dying in this country, but we didn't know it because we don't read 3 or 4 newspapers. We just watch Good Morning America in the morning, and we're laughing and cooking and whatever else they're doing. But I think it's really important that seeing that and knowing that it exists is what catalyzes people to move and to do something, because now you see someone from your community that's dying every day. And we want that type of individual leadership. And I think this generation is so over it. And we're called the microwave generation. We say that we're impatient, and we're because our generation is dealing with it, our mom's generation is dealing with it, our grandparents' generation dealt with it, and we really believe that we can make a change.
So I know you do a lot of work with the young professionals and reach over 2 million young professionals around the country. So what are they saying besides they're done with it about what's going on in our communities? And do they think that there is a leader that they're following right now?
They're following themselves. They're following themselves, and they're following themselves because they have ideas about how they can uniquely impact the situation, which I think is amazing. The work that we do with the National Urban League and with the National Urban League Young Professionals is informed by a policy agenda, and it's a robust policy agenda, and it includes us. And so we can use that information to be able to push for advocacy changes and things of that nature. But individually, when we go home and we see a protest on Twitter, we just get up and go. And we walk around the community. I met a young lady recently who's been doing some great work in Baltimore, and there is a pocket of individuals who are being affected by the slayings of young black men and women in our communities that we don't even touch with the young professionals. We're the young professionals, and then there's the folks in the community, right, that are family members and things. And so there's an opportunity for us, like this young lady does. She goes back into the community and has porch conversations with people about how they can actually make change in their communities. And that's what's going to be necessary in order to bring all of us together to make some type of change.
I think that's a great point. I just want to add in, think of Sandra Bland, right? Sandra Bland was someone who was an activist, but would any of us have known Sandra Bland's name had she not been arrested and ultimately died in a jail? But she was an activist in her own right, using the avenues and the tools that she had to speak out on the issues that matter most to this generation. And so, much to Brandy's point, a lot of it is happening individually with people just using their voices in whatever way they can, whether it's through social media, whether it's by going door to door, whether it's by touching other young people. But I think a lot of what's happening is happening on an individual basis. And we find inspiration in other leaders, but it's not necessarily that we're following a leader.
And a lot of people don't even know that Sandra Bland was just one. This month alone, there have been 5 women who have died in jails. Usually I had to worry about, oh, I don't want to have a son because he's going to have to face all these problems. Now I have to worry about it for my daughters as well. Right. And a lot of times we would, in my mother's generation, they would run to the church as a place of refuge, of a place to find those next steps. So, Reverend Lee, how relevant is the black church right now, and how are they getting involved in this movement?
I think the black church is extremely relevant. I think the challenge is the black church is its worst PR firm. That people don't know what the church is doing, and people assume that what happens is that people right now, because we're so TV driven, that when you look at TV, you look at the mega churches on TV and you say that's what the church is doing. And so therefore you don't see a lot of social justice, you don't see a lot of folks standing up on TV, and so you say that the church isn't doing anything. But look at what our enemies are attacking. When that young man decided to go and kill 9 folks, where did he go? To the church. When folks are burning up churches, as a result of that, what did he burn it? The churches. When that young man went and he burnt a mother and went and did the horrible, horrific killing at Mother Emanuel AME Church, and I'm an AME, that you all of a sudden heard the name of Clementa Pinckney, the pastor there. He had been doing amazing work, part of the state legislature. That church had a history of social justice that went back all the way to Denmark Vesey, but no one would have known that, no one would have talked about that. Just unknown brother, unknown church that's been doing great work, but just like you all said about other folks, that you have all these people who are doing the work, but no one really knows about it because they're not these huge major names and don't have this huge major platform. And so I would say the church is still extremely relevant, and you can tell it by what our enemies are attacking.
And some would even argue that Reverend Clementa was the target at that point because of all the work he was doing and because he was being so vocal at that point. And I'm not sure that a lot of people, maybe I'm wrong, are they willing to give their lives for this fight?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, because I think we've seen people give their lives for this fight. And there's sitting here in the role of an appointed government official, I want to add one thread to connect this, because something else is different now, and it started in 2008, and that's that we actually have more progressive elected leadership that does actually create a different relationship with community. And I say that because you may not know this, but my mayor is white. Shh, don't tell anyone. It's a big secret. But I say this because one of the things he has done is he said he's done 3 very critical things that are a game changer in New York, but I think also organizing around cities nationally, which is one, that we have to have a different relationship with community. So he created a clergy council. There is very few times that there are issues that happen in New York City where he does not deploy every last one of us to a church in order to interface with community. So to the point of the relevance of community, including when we're trying to figure out how to have a different relationship between community and the police department. Secondly, he has actually focused deeply on how we create more youth engagement in the city. And remember, New York City is 67% people of color. And done several things to actually create opportunities for youth to tell government what youth need and create more services for youth. And I think the third is being willing to talk about race. And I think that is a fundamentally different kind of leadership when you have elected leadership that is willing to talk about race, and when you have someone who will stand up and say, I have had to give my son the talk and my daughter the talk. That's a very different kind of public dialogue when you have elected leadership that does that. And the one thing we should not lose sight of is demographically, 21% of eligible voters are between the ages of 18 and 29 in this country now. And that was part of the equation for Barack Obama in 2008. It's a big part of our equation. I said eligible, not participating. And as we know, and by the way, 15% of them are black. The second largest demographic of that pool. And as we know, one of the major attacks that we're facing state by state is on the ability for folks to vote, once again, but in a different form. So I think that's something that needs our immediate attention if we're going to think about some of our equations for hope and success.
And it seems like there are so many issues that also need our immediate attention, you know, the injustices in the education system, you know, and the jail system, and schools, careers. Should we be focusing on one issue at a time and attacking that with all of our energy, or should we simultaneously be hitting all of these issues at the same time?
Well, I think we can operate on the we can walk and chew gum at the same time type of principle. I mean, and this has come up before in many different places. I mean, during the 50s and 60s, people focused on a couple of main issues: access to public accommodations, the franchise, ending Jim Crow formally. You know, in the South, because those were easy targets, it was low-hanging fruit. And then that phase of the movement became a victim of its own success, because then nationally people thought, well, blacks got everything that they want. And we're still fighting that battle today, because a lot of people still refuse to see the racism that still exists in American society, because they were like, well, you got the Voting Rights Act, Shelby County notwithstanding, and you got the Civil Rights Act, and so people don't want to see the nuances of racism. Even in the 1980s, when people were talking about divestment and sort of sanctions against South Africa, people were like, well, you should be focused on problems in the, domestically. So I think we can do many things, and I think also people are naturally inclined to have certain causes that they care about. And so people are naturally probably going to focus more attention on some things than others. And what you care about most might not be what I care about most, but what I care about most might not be what you care about most. And I think we should encourage people to really take up their passionate cause and not actually turn their noses up when somebody else is doing something else. Because basically what we can do is we can cover everything through specialization. And I think so many times we focus on having to be unified that we forget that there are all kinds of problems. Like when we talk about the issues, it is amazing when I look at the Gary, Indiana agenda from the 1970s, and I look at what has not been achieved on that agenda, and it's most of it. When I am finishing a book on race and representation in the Obama administration, and so I went back and read parts of the Kerner Commission report, and when I listened to the descriptions in the Kerner Commission report from the 1960s, I might as well be reading the New York Times today. It's funny, there's this part in the report where Kenneth Clark, so the person who created the Dahl test, which helped Brown versus Board of Education and along in its argument and logic, he says in the Kerner Commission report that he was reading sort of accounts of what was happening in the 1960s in places like Watts and Newark and Detroit. And he's like, this sounds like stuff that I used to read about in the 1920s. And so it's funny. I mean, that's the thing that I think people need to know. The struggle continues, and the issues are actually still the same. We're still fighting in many ways some of the same battles. So we just have to figure out what is the right way to tackle these problems so that 30 years from now, something hasn't erupted again, and people are like, oh, wow, that sounds very similar to what happened in 2014 and 2015. We have to figure out a way to end that struggle and end that cycle. And what that means is that we have to be historically grounded and think about context and think about what worked and what didn't work so that we don't repeat the same mistakes in the future. But we also need to be broad-based, because a lot of this stuff actually tends to be very multi-pronged in terms of the source of the problem. So you've got to do it all.
So as we're looking for this new voice, this new leadership, where should it start? In the home, in the schools, in the community, these prominent leaders?
You know, to the point about all issues all the time, I used to talk about that all the time and tell people you have to be focused everywhere because we're losing on all fronts. So there are things that we should be doing. But as you look at our history, and from a historical perspective, Reconstruction, we didn't do that right. Like in the United States, we didn't really fix the problem of people looking at African Americans as the same. And so we continue to have that problem, and I don't care if it's policing, I don't care if it's at your job, someone isn't giving you an opportunity, we're still having problems with this concept of black people not being as good as, or not being able to sit at the same tables. And until we deal with that, we're going to continue to have all these issues in various spaces. So we may have a great mayor who's willing to have everyone at the table. But we have a lot of elected officials that their whole cabinet and all the people that walk around them look exactly like them. What is that about? So we really are going to have to tackle race so that we can have the important conversations about everything else: health disparities, wealth disparities. The fact that the reason that we don't have wealth has to do with what's happened since Reconstruction, and the fact that when we wanted to go buy houses, we could not buy houses in certain areas. We could not have the values of our homes appreciated at the same rate as other people in this country. And so before we can really tackle issues, someone needs to be able to look at me as a black woman and see me for who I am and not what they assume that I am. And when that happens, then we can deal with everything else.
You know, I would just say that we have, what strikes me as odd is after 244 years of slavery, after 79 years of Jim and Jane Crow, after 40 years of building a prison industrial complex through the war on drugs, we're still having the same conversations about leadership. We're still having the same conversations about the needs and how we solve these problems. And one of the titles that I own as the CEO of the Las Vegas Urban League is Chief Solutionist. You know, I don't allow my team to have a conversation about a problem unless it comes with a solution. And the truth of the matter is that this will 50 years from now, we'll still be having the same conversation unless we decide that we're going to solve the problems for ourselves. And what that means is we're going to have leaders that are focused in lanes on different subject matters that are important to us to solve the problem, but we're going to stop looking outward to the solution. The solution is within us. Each and every one of us can solve these problems, and until we own that, we're going to have the same discussion. And frankly, I get tired of it. I get tired of having the same discussion over and over again, knowing that 50 years ago we were marching for jobs and justice, and then we just did it again.
Can I just say one word we haven't said, and that because I think solutions is really an important frame, is the one thing we haven't said is strategy. So I agree there's not one front, there are multiple fronts, and we have to fight them all. But what we have also seen throughout the years, because we shouldn't talk as if we haven't made any progress, because that would simply also not be true. So we haven't solved the problems, but we have made progress. It's that we have to be aligned enough so that we come together on strategy at the right time. I mean, Martin Luther King was not the whole movement, but he was a consummate strategist. And he was not the only strategist. Barack Obama has been a consummate strategist. We have multiple, so one form of leadership that we should not forget is the leadership of strategy.
But also, in focusing on strategy, we also have to deal with our own issues of communication. Especially some of the generational communication issues we're having right now, and what it means to be talking I'm laughing a lot, Janae, because I always end up on the New Voices of Youth panel, but I'm 47 years old. And so I'm just like, well, as y'all are putting me there, to keep me from my midlife crisis a little bit more, because I'm still young, I still got it. But there is the need for us to be able to have this kind of communication process with a younger generation and let it go all the way down with a generation that feels like they don't have space, feels like they don't have voice at the table, and right now, like, we're going to do what the heck on our own. And that's a wonderful thing, and that fervor is wonderful, but there's some stuff they can learn from the old school. There are some places at the table they can get to from the old school. There's some lessons the old school learned that they don't have to learn if we would just have some conversations. But that has to deal with our ego, that has to deal with issues of humility, that has to deal with issues of platform, that has to deal with issues of I'm going to let some stuff go, at least let these young cats know that there's room for them and I don't have to see them as a threat to me and in what I'm doing, but we're all about the same kind of a thing. And so we're going to have to grapple with some of that stuff as well if we're truly going to be effective, and not just the generational stuff, but the class stuff. That we're going to have to deal with the class stuff. Honestly, we're going to have to deal with some of the colorism stuff. We're going to have to deal with some of the our own 50 Shades of Gray stuff, the 50 Shades of Brown stuff. But we're going to have to work through some of these conversational, interpersonal issues so that we can actually be able to do the strategy and work to the solutions, because we're not going to be able to do any of it if we're not talking to each other.
And we definitely want to have an opportunity. We definitely want to have an opportunity for you all to end on solutions and strategies and resources. But first, we want to take 2 questions from the audience. We have a microphone right here and a microphone in the first aisle over there if you have any questions from the audience. And while we're waiting for those people to line up, I know in your work with the school and Emory, you study a lot of this thought of a post-racial society, and you mentioned this conversation of race that we have to overcome. Is a post-racial society possible?
In theory, it's possible.
In theory. Will it ever happen on Earth?
Maybe. And I don't want to sound pessimistic to say that it won't happen in my lifetime, but I think we need to be prepared that we might be setting this up for future generations. So, first, I have books that have post-racial in the title, and that's a marketing ploy. I don't believe that there's such a thing as post-racialism, at least not right now, and certainly not in 2007 and 2008 when the term first gets coined. But What I was talking about there was that there's a certain cadre of black leadership who has to appear racially transcendent because it's politically expedient for them to do so. So the question is, are they actually willing behind the scenes to take one for the team, to perhaps lose an election, to take a stand for issues of concern to African Americans? And that's been a huge tension kind of within the African American political community about whether some people are actually more self-interested than they are community interested. I think we can have that debate kind of going forward. But when people try to present issues of concern to African Americans in broad strokes and broad terms, and I'm not talking about the difference between Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, because I think the critique that's out there about people trying to minimize the fact that blacks are disproportionately and unfairly targeted is actually apt, and it needs to be made at this point. But if you want people to be able to win statewide office, if you want people to win national office, they're not going to run a presidential campaign or a Senate campaign or a gubernatorial campaign like they're running for NAACP or Urban League president. So you've got to sort of have that sort of, you've got to take that into account. And they have a seat at the table just as much as somebody who is from a local community who is very grounded in their community and very grounded in black nationalism would also deserve a seat at the table so that we can have that type of dialogue. When we're thinking about sort of what the post-racial ideal looks like, I always say that if I can, as a social scientist, look at a black child, a white child, a Latino child, and an Asian child, and control for class and predict that those kids will have the exact same life chances when they're 30 and 60 and 75 years old, then that's when I know that we're finally post-racial. Right now, if you look at the life expectancy, probability of graduating from high school, probability of going to jail, probability of getting a college degree, those vary based on race. So even after we take class into account, even after we take region into account, even when we take parental background into account, all of those things suggest that black and Latino and Native American kids are far behind the 8 ball in comparison to their white and Asian peers. That is because of race and racism. So for that reason, we're not post-racial yet. So just because one black man got elected president doesn't mean that anything happened, because you notice there are only 2 in the Senate.
Right.
You notice that, you know, we don't have a black governor right now. So there are lots of other places where we don't see that type of parity and representation, and we're going to have to work for that, and we're going to have to work for the time when black people are not disproportionately pulled over by the cops and killed and, you know, being poorly educated and poorly fed and poorly, you know, getting health care treatment and other kinds of things. So
we still have a long way to go. And we have a few questions. We only have a few minutes left, so we're going to have to do the fire round. We're going to ask your question, and one person on the panel can answer. Then we'll go to the next person so we can wrap up soon. Please.
Good morning. My name is Jasmine Jones, and I am from Broward County, Florida. My question is very targeted, and mainly because I do understand Black Lives Matter. But I'm also asking is, since we're in America, everyone considered African American. Well, I'm happen to be from Haiti. A lot of people that are Caribbean also went up, I would say mainstream see us. We all one brown black folk, right? So I'm trying to find out to see what assistance can be giving, or have you even guys heard of what's going on in Dominican Republic in terms of all the destructions and people Haitian descent that are folks being pretty much reallocated, want to be deported, and about 1 million of them will be reported back to Haiti just because they don't want us around it after exploiting us and also taking everything we've got. And what can be done?
Maya, you want to take that one?
Well, I think this is an incredibly important point, because even what is blackness is as the demographics of the country change, you know, it's true, the blackness is very complex because we come from there is an African diaspora. I think this is incredibly important from a strategy perspective, is how we understand our different experiences with shared problems and how we figure out the strategic alignment whereby we are supporting multiple struggles of people in the diaspora that fundamentally focuses on who we include here in the United States and how we include them. So one of the things that we've done has actually been very vocal in public about the fact that we think there is too much racism happening in the way Haitians are being treated both in the Dominican Republic, and then what it means for national policy and for immigration policy, and how we create policies that demonstrate that we will be a welcoming place, like creating municipal ID cards that you can get whether you have citizenship legal citizenship or not, so that you can get the benefits of services and programs from government and nonprofit institutions without making yourself vulnerable to immigration. So those are the kinds of things that I think are critical.
And I think the other thing that's actually really important is for us to always remember that the struggle for racial justice has actually always been a global struggle. And so I think probably in an American context, we're used to thinking domestically, and our educational system doesn't always emphasize things such as Pan-Africanism, so that we understand that there is such a thing as global blackness, and that ethnicity matters within the study of African Americans as it would for other groups. I think for people who do Latino studies and Asian American studies, they're very used to looking at ethnic sub-ethnicities and looking at that type of variation. In African American studies, we haven't done that to the extent that we should. And I think your point is actually really, really valid, and it helps us to remember that blackness is extremely diverse.
All right, I think they're telling me we have time for one more question.
Okay, so my name is Tiffany Neachai, and I'm representing Buffalo, the young professionals. And there are tensions between the black church and different variations of blackness presently, and most of this is because we're not seeing in our local communities a lot of black church leaders standing up on these issues, and sometimes it comes from a very it seems to come from a one-sided space in terms of gender and class and sexuality and spirituality and all that. How can we as young professionals engage our local black churches and share with them our concerns in a way that's not only respectful, but in ways that can help us to work together in a terms of, so that we can still as young people see them as on the ground and fighting this fight?
Reverend Lee?
So I think there are a couple of issues that you're having to deal with in that. One of the greater challenges, even in the black church, but you see it not just in the black church, mainstream church, corporations, etc., is the challenge of what baby boomers have done for us. And so because of the great influx of baby boomers, there's actually a log jam. That usually there's this kind of cyclical kind of handing over of leadership that then puts a younger crew in leadership or position for leadership so that they're able to have better conversations with younger generations. And that's not necessarily has happened as smoothly just because there's so many boomers, because folks because the economy went to heck and folks can't even retire, those kinds of pieces. One. What I believe needs to happen is a couple of pieces. There are some respectful conversations that can happen, and there are some conversations that can be respectful but with fire that need to happen. And that's the truth. There are some conversations because it's your church too. And I mean the church universal, the church global, it's your church as well. And so therefore, there's a need for a younger generation to step up and say, no, this is mine too. And so there's a need for this church to be relevant to all of our needs. There's a need for this church to be relevant to the needs of, that there's no way in the world that folks can be getting killed in our communities and you're not saying anything about it, and all you're doing is shouting on Sundays. Right. That you can't shout on Sundays and we getting shot Monday through Saturdays. That's just not going to be acceptable, that we're going to need you to be able to deal with the issues that we're dealing with in this community. And so I think there's a pressure that needs to happen. But I think you're seeing it, though, not just in the church. Even if you look at Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter has put a pressure on everybody up the chain. That these young folks have put a pressure on more traditional civil rights organizations. They just put a pressure on everybody, on elected officials, to say, no, you're going to start dealing with some of this stuff because this is some of the stuff we're dealing with, and we need. And so the same thing needs to happen in the church, but it can happen in the church not in a way that's saying we can't stand you, but in a way that's saying, no, this is our church too. And because it's our church too, then it needs to deal with and represent us and deal with the issues that we're going through.
If I could just add a...
No, you can't. We're out of time. But I will give you a chance to speak. You each have about 20 seconds, because they're rushing us here, to give any solutions, strategies, or resources that you would like to offer our audience. Please try to keep it concise, because we got to move for time. All right, we'll start with...
Oh, great. So you start with me.
Yeah, sorry.
solutions, I do think that some of the solutions that were presented here are viable. I think we do need healing. I think that's something that we haven't talked about, healing and therapy as a community, because there are so many traumas that have been passed on and on and on through the generations that we haven't completely healed from. That's not really all that I wanted to say, but I know we're short on time, and I thank you.
Thank you, Janae. Brandy?
I think it's important that we do have those intergenerational conversations, that they're candid and they're real, and that we stop relying on the fact that we have made progress and we start talking about the fact that although we have made progress, there are serious ills that we need to address every day, because sometimes we're a little too complacent in that, oh, but it's better. Well, folks still dying. So #WeGotNow, Team NULYP, at NULYP, please join the movement. We have young professionals all over this event, and they're willing to embrace you and to help you to do advocacy work as it relates to the National Urban League agenda and our move forward.
Thank you. Kevin?
I would say, the real solution is to get up and do something, get involved. I just completed a program called the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program, and it's a program put on by President Clinton and President Bush to identify the next generation of leaders to help solve the problems that we're facing. I would encourage each and every one of you to apply to a program like that. Go to presidentialleadershipscholars.org or any of your local leadership program, Leadership Florida, Leadership Las Vegas, Leadership etc., and get involved. But don't just focus only on things that are familiar and comfortable to you. You have to make yourself a little bit uncomfortable and to walk in areas where you're not used to walking, because it's going to take all of us, whether you look like me and you or not, in order to solve these problems.
Reverend Lee?
We have to make sure that policy stays on the table and not just protests. I'm blessed to work with Black Youth Vote, a national coalition of Black civic participation, and we just held a Black Men and Boys Day on the Hill, in which we were training and took about close to 200 brothers, but not just the kind of usual suspects that we'll see at these pieces, but just regular brothers, some brothers who didn't have degrees, just the range of brothers, but we trained them about what it meant. We trained them on issues, we trained them on policy, and then trained them on what it meant to visit the Hill, and took them to sit with senators and congresspeople to deal with their issues. That we have to, even as we're protesting and pushing that in, that we have to be training those young brothers and sisters on how to engage with the other area of the game, with the other area of the strategy, which is policy.
All right, thank you. Dr. Ahn.
So I think I kind of want to take an old school thing and make it new. So we need to have freedom schools. And so I think these are important because there's a lot of history that people don't know and that hasn't been transmitted across generations. And so now is the time for us to do that, because people will actually be able to apply those historical lessons to what they see at the present day. I think it's in part teaching people how to be consumers of news, to make sure that you are a regular consumer of news. I think part of that history is understanding to the church question that churches that got involved in the civil rights movement weren't all the SCLC leaders' churches. It was oftentimes people in the laity who were convincing their pastors that they needed to take a stand on issues. So it's in part infiltrating those organizations and making those leaders accountable to take public stands on those issues. And I think once that dialogue starts, once people are aware of issues, once people can, in a common sort of framework, talk about racism and structural racism and what inequality actually looks like, I think that will help actually clarify which issues need to be targeted first strategically. And I think it will actually inspire people about how to generate ideas to actually create the solutions that are needed to solve these problems.
Thank you. And last but not least, Maya.
Septima Clark, policy, ditto, ditto. Voting, voting, voting. Those are my 3 solutions.
All right, I like that. Very concise. And also, I want to make sure you try to follow all of them and the organizations on social media. That's one other way to continue getting involved. I'm at Mr. Shannon Lanier. Resources I have that I looked up are, of course, NUL.org, the IamEmpowered.com website, where you have all the statistics behind the State of Black America report that the National Urban League put out. FlexYourRights.org and 100 Black Men are all great resources to also use to know your rights and know what you should and shouldn't do if you are stopped by the police and put in that situation. So again, please give a round of applause to our amazing panel. We could sit here and talk for hours with them.